right. Galen, hello, and welcome to another edition of Global Tantrum. Ear, 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 ear.
What
You
up,
like that?
man? I got
Yeah.
nothing to match that.
We're still called Global Tantrum. I'm Steve Palley. Galen, you're Galen Jackson. You're also
I am.
a tenured professor of international relations at Williams College. We went to graduate school together at UCLA. I'm also a PhD in international relations. What up? Let's go Bruins. For the Sacramento Kings, my Sacramento Kings just traded for UCLA legend Zach LaVine, which I would be excited about, except that we gave up Fox to do it. So that sucks.
He's having a good year though, man. You could have gotten a much worse version of him.
I agree. So we'll see what comes out of that. That's neither here nor there. We did not want to talk more about the situation in Gaza this week, but we decided that we had to because Trump said some crazy stuff and the wheels are now in motion.
Yeah, my whole career now just basically is like US foreign policy. I just want to not do the Middle East anymore, and I keep not being able to transition away. So
we were hoping for at least like a week's break, but yeah, the situation has escalated seemingly, although it's mostly at the level of rhetoric right now. It remains to be seen what will actually happen. But the rhetoric was, I think, incendiary and dangerous enough that we have to spend another week talking about this shit, which is a bummer. But let's do it. Galen, you want to jump in with both feet?
Look, I just want to the first thing I'll say is one thing Trump said is we haven't worked this out. Nothing has worked. And he's not wrong about that. That said, this was a series of ideas that I thought were really pretty crazy.
Yeah, it's like there's outside the box, and then there's leaving the room, closing the door, leaving the house, getting in your car, driving across an international border, and getting out. That's what this set of ideas represents against the sort of Trump is an outside the box thinker. No, he's left the fucking country. He's left the atmosphere, right? by historical comparison, when it comes to the range of potential solutions for the Israeli-Palestine conflict, right?
That's correct. I would also, just as a brief aside, I just went grocery shopping and Trader Joe's only let me buy one carton of eggs. So that's one thing he has not fixed, is the eggs issue.
Yep.
But leaving that aside, essentially what Trump said, and it's a little unclear what is meant, although I think we both have our thoughts on what's being implied here. But essentially what he said was the United States was now going to, quote, take over, end quote, Gaza in the, it would seem, not too distant future. And it's not totally clear what he believes the legal status of that territory is going to be, if it's going to be U.S. territory, which would be extremely strange, among other things. Or
let me stop you right there. Okay. President Trump was elected to lead, not to read. I'm quoting, of course, President McBain from The Simpsons. Not super interested in the legal niceties of
fair enough, man.
Any situation, including constitutional situations in the United States or federal statute. That'll be another show.
So
international law, though. Yeah.
There's some details to be worked out. It seems like he was talking about some sort of internationalized zone with lots of hotel and real estate deals being done. It was also unclear whether, when he referred, the other important thing he said, to the displacement of the 2.2 million Palestinians who live in the Gaza Strip being displaced, if that was meant to be a permanent displacement or temporary. So his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, said that this would be an interim resettlement. I think his press secretary said something to the effect that it would be temporary. It's not clear to me that is what Trump actually meant. And I suspect that is not what was actually meant. The Israelis, for their part, both the broader public, it would seem, based on the data we have, but certainly at the leadership level, seems pretty supportive of this idea. And although they are referring to the displacement right now as voluntary, I don't think that's how this would go down. And the Israeli military, I believe, is already taking some steps to actually implement this happening. The
That's
other thing
right.
Trump said is that the Palestinians would something like live elsewhere, happy and safe in the world's most beautiful communities or something like that.
Yes. So I have some additional data for you. First of all, Netanyahu reacted to this idea, I'm paraphrasing, by saying it was a very interesting and important idea that merited careful study.
And if you were
And
watching the press conference, you could just see it on his face, by the way. Like when Trump said this, BB being like, you guys think I'm out there?
like, never expected this. The more right wing members of Trump's cabinet are over the moon about this idea. They love this idea. And indeed, the Israeli military has apparently begun planning both a port and an airport and the logistics for how people would be moved from the Gaza Strip to the port of Ashdod, I think, and or maybe it's the other way around, the port of Eilat and the airport in Ashdod. I'm not exactly sure where the airport is and where the seaport is relatively, but they're
Eilat is on the very southern tip of Israel. It's access point to the Red Sea.
that might be the seaport then. But anyway, planning is apparently starting to move ahead. Nobody has been relocated, to be clear. The neighbors, the Arab neighbors and the international community, meaning mostly the European Union, have reacted to this idea with, I would say, unleavened horror.
Just the least
Yeah.
unsurprising reaction one could imagine, particularly from
Yes.
the rest of the Arab world.
Yeah, the Jordanians and the Egyptians have rejected the idea out of hand, as have the Saudis. These are all important U.S. allies. All of America's allies in Europe have rejected this out of hand as being against international law, which it is, the Geneva Conventions in particular, the United Nations Charter, and so on. And we could have a big argument about the strength of international law ever and now, whether it still exists. Trump seems to be underlining the fact that he doesn't care about any of that.
Which
Um,
doesn't necessarily put him that much out of step with past US administrations, I
oh
guess I
yeah,
would
to be
just say.
clear, we've been ignoring international law readily for certainly during the course of this century and even part of the last century, even though we helped establish it. And that's one of the major. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. So greeted with universal surprise, abhorrence, and condemnation, which is what you'd expect. And I think we were talking about this prior to the show. There's a 2x2 here, matrix.
Yeah.
There on one axis, there's voluntary versus involuntary. And on the other axis, there is temporary relocation and permanent relocation. And we know from public opinion data that life in Gaza was miserable prior to the war. And I think up to a third of Gazans expressed interest in leaving Gaza at that time.
Do you
Now,
know if that was temporarily or permanently?
I don't. I think
Okay.
they were just asked, but it makes sense because Gaza was
It's been
frozen, it was
leveled.
stagnant. Yeah.
It's been
And
completely
now,
leveled.
yeah, now 70% of the buildings in Gaza are rubble. So the the Palestinians that are filtering back into northern Gaza are coming back to no water, no gas, no electricity.
This, by the way, is after whatever 13, 14 years of being under a blockade that
Correct.
made living in Gaza very difficult to begin with.
No economic growth, stagnation, all the hospitals are destroyed. So the facts on the ground are that Gaza is not particularly livable right now. However, a lot of Gazans have expressed zero interest, sub-zero interest in leaving, either prior to this or even afterwards. They know how hard it's going to be. Hamas, for their part, have rejected this out of hand, as you'd expect. And a lot of this relates to the history of the Gaza Strip, which connects intimately to the beginnings of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the birth of the state of Israel. Right, Galen?
Yeah, but before I just talk briefly about that, the other thing I wanted to flag was Trump also was asked his thoughts about Israel annexing the West Bank.
I actually missed that.
Oh, he was asked about it. The other much larger territory in which Palestinians hoped to build an independent state. And he basically was like, ask me again in 4 weeks.
Wow.
So
What's happening in 4 weeks? Anything in particular? Or
I don't know. And the other thing I was going to say, if this comes to pass, and I really am not sure if it will, but I would not be surprised. The US takeover part, I was like, what the hell is happening? That I had no.
it really doesn't fit with
With anything
Trump's.
Trump has said, yeah.
Yeah, he is not interested in deploying U.S. troops abroad.
He said that the US is not going to put boots on the ground. Now, how one actually executes this without putting boots on the ground is a very interesting question to me.
The IDF has boots on the ground, right? But then does the United States gain control of the strip anyway?
Like I said, there are details that were not.
Yeah.
But that two by two matrix that you laid out, I guess if this is what's happening, I would predict it would be the involuntary permanence is actually what they mean here.
Yeah, because like, why would you leave it half finished?
The whole point of this idea, regardless of what you think about it, and I'm not making any claims to like it.
No.
But it would seem to be the argument is we haven't figured this out. We're not going to figure this out. Let's get it over with. And the way to do that is by forced displacements of mass numbers of Palestinians.
Yes. Which I have said and will say again amounts to ethnic cleansing. I do not think this could be accomplished peacefully, by the way.
I don't either. That's why I'm saying it's going to be involuntary. It's going to be coerced. And I see no way that if Gazans are displaced in mass, that they're going to be allowed to return. And this gets to your
certainly not. Yeah.
This gets to your question about the historical context, which is among the reasons, and I would argue probably the most important reasons that the backlash to Trump saying this has been so pronounced, not just among Palestinians, but throughout the whole of the Arab world, is that Palestinians have a very direct historical connection to precisely what Trump is talking about, which goes back to the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. We can go into kind of the details of what happened if you're interested in talking about that. But in broad terms, essentially, the United Nations laid out a plan to partition what is now Israel proper, the West Bank and Gaza, into a Jewish state and an Arab state. One point that Israelis and Zionists make all the time is that the Zionists accepted the plan and the Arabs did not. And the result was a war. And in the course of that war, Israel expanded its borders beyond what the UN committee had suggested. And this led eventually to the displacement of about 750,000 Palestinians. And today, depending on how you define what a refugee is, there's a whole debate about this. Hey, are descendants of refugees also refugees? Like, are grandchildren of refugees? Do they count? What if they've been given citizenship in a place in like Georgia? Does that still meet the definition of refugee? That debate is actually a pretty hot one. But this is known as the catastrophe,
the disaster
in the Arab world. Yes. And you saw concerns about this being floated or expressed by Palestinians immediately after October 7th, that this could preface a second Nakba.
Or the continuation of the first Nakba. Another way to look at this is that it's been on hold for 70 or 80 years. And the course of 4 Arab-Israeli wars, or 5, depending on how you count. And yeah, it is basically the case that all this dates back to 1947 through 1949. There was a sequence of events whereby
could go earlier depending on how you look at it.
You could go to the Balfour Declaration, 1917. We don't need to go back that far, I don't think. Anyway, basically the British mandate, so the UK controlled this area up until I think 1948 when they exited. And as soon as they exited, I think literally the same day or the next day, Israel declares independence, and immediately afterward, I believe 5 Arab armies invade.
So there's like there's a civil conflict. There's 2 phases to the war. There's the war between the pre-Israeli Zionists. Yeah, that's the fighting force, the official fighting force, joined by other paramilitary organizations, which that happens immediately after the UNSCOP, United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, votes to partition the territory at the end of November 1947. And then the interstate phase you're referring to happens immediately after Israel declares itself independent in May 1948, once the British withdrawal has been completed.
That's right. So we have Syria, Jordan, Egypt,
Iraq.
Iraq and Lebanon,
Correct.
and the Saudis are far away.
The Saudis, I think, send like a token, very small force. Yeah.
And this operation is nominally under the control of King Abdullah of Jordan, if I'm remembering correctly.
Although the Jordanians and the Israelis, by the way, have secret covert agreements in the background.
It's interesting. Suffice it to say that these 5 Arab armies don't cooperate because these are relatively new states, post-colonial states too. They have their eyes on various pieces of territory themselves. And suffice it also to say that the Israelis are ready.
Yeah. The other critical piece, which this is I guess for people that study it, it's not forgotten, but it's a little known fact for more casual observers, is it's actually the Soviets that really help out the Zionist cause early on, when things aren't looking necessarily great for the Zionists in the spring of 48. They get a much needed arms supply via Czechoslovakia.
I did not know that. And it's not what you'd expect. But this is prior to the formation of the U.S.-Israel alliance.
True. And then like the Soviets flipped pretty quickly. They had this idea that, hey, like the early Zionists were friendly with socialist ideas and
the kibbutzim, right?
Yeah. And maybe this will help screw over the British in the Middle East. It might, but by the early 50s, they've flipped on it. But the influx of Czech arms is a pretty big deal. The other big moment, which we should discuss related directly to what we're talking about today, is there's an infamous massacre that takes place in a village called Deir Yassin. And anyone who studies the topic, or if you talk to Palestinians today, Deir Yassin looms very large. And essentially, this was a village that had an understanding of, or a non-belligerency pact, that it was basically sitting out the war. And a group of, or a paramilitary organization, particularly the Irgun, which was, I don't want to misspeak, but it may have been designated a terrorist organization. I'll have to check that.
By the British, I believe that they actually bombed the British mandate.
The head of it, Menachem Begin, famously, I think, was responsible for bombing the King David Hotel when the British were using it as their headquarters.
He became the leader of the Likud bloc.
And ultimately was prime minister and made peace with Egypt. Yeah.
Yeah, down the road.
But what happens is, I think the number is like 100 to 125 civilians, including women and children. I think the evidence shows they were not housing sort of Arab irregular forces, were basically massacred, which is awful and tragic in and of itself. But one effect that has, and I believe Begin made comments to this effect, hey, it was worth it, was this word of this spreads throughout the area. And this contributes to the flight of many Palestinians from the war zone.
There's your voluntary relocation right there, right? So this is the first time it happened. And speaking of Gaza specifically, I think we're looking at 250,000 Palestinian refugees into Gaza. Gaza at that time had, I think, 80,000 inhabitants. So instant quadrupling.
And today it's either the most densely populated area, or certainly among them, in the world.
And between 80 and 90% of Gaza's inhabitants today are descendants of those 250,000 refugees from 1949 or 48 and 49, I guess.
It's on, throughout that period. And then by the way, like there's another war in 1967, and I think there's roughly another 300,000 Palestinian refugees as a result of that conflict, although those are mainly from the West Bank.
Yes.
I should say there was this whole thing among a lot of college students who I see quite a bit of, given my profession, like in the year following October 7th, being like, it's not complicated. Like, it is. It's complicated.
It's very complicated. I think what you see though is again, taking specifically the case of Gaza, we get 250,000 Palestinian refugees in. There were some Jews living in Gaza at the time too, about 10,000 of them, and they get pushed out. This is classically what happens in violent partitions. And other examples of this, particularly when the British Empire folded up, like the partition of India, is another great example of this, where you get a lot of forced relocations between what became Pakistan and India. So population transfers of Hindus and Muslims, right? Very similar process.
Greeks and Turks after World War One. That's another one.
So all this to say that this is not like a historical irregularity, unfortunately. It does happen. And when it does happen, it is never peaceful and a lot of people die.
Yeah, I should just say, like, one point Israelis make is almost all of the Jews living in the Arab world after the first Arab-Israeli war were expelled, and many ended up in Israel. And it's interesting, sort of the period after World War One, when all of this was starting to come to a head. If you look at early Zionist writings on the topic, even going back to Theodor Herzl, the father of Zionism, they weren't necessarily super open about it or enthusiastically saying these things in public, but this idea of what was called transfer, which was taken basically exactly from what you're saying.
You don't need to be enthusiastic about a
They weren't necessarily like advertising that this was the plan, but it's only going to your point that historically, this is really tragic events, but this was not unusual that to be the norm. So that is what it was referred to as, hey, if we're going to take over more territory and be in the area, that's going to involve the transfer of the native Arab population. You did see writing like that. Like, when I say this is more complicated than it seems, just to lay out some of the arguments out there, we know for sure there were just straight up expulsions. Okay. Like we know there were instances of that. We've known that for a while, but certainly since Yitzhak Rabin, who was Israel's prime minister a few times, wrote in his memoir, hey, David Ben-Gurion, first prime minister, ordered me, and I think it was Yigal Allon, to clear out these villages. But part of it is just, it's a very small area geographically, and the populations were intermixed. So you would expect some degree of fight for that reason alone. There are instances
not unlike the Balkans, right?
Yeah.
Muslims and Serbs and Croats.
There's instances like Haifa, I think, is the big case, where there was an Arab majority and many of them left in the wake of hearing about Deir Yassin. I'm not saying there weren't forced expulsions. We know that there were, but that does not represent the totality of the 750,000 people who ultimately became refugees. But
although again, there's a fine line between voluntary. If you create the conditions that necessitate voluntary, is that encouraged? What do you call it?
So then this is where it gets like, so I asked that exact question in class when I have students say, hey, if you chose to leave, you don't get to come back. And I'm like, okay, what if it's a situation where you weren't really given a choice? And what the Zionists said at the time was like, we accepted the partition, the Arabs didn't. We can start adjudicating like the origins of the conflict, and you can see why none of these arguments ever get resolved.
No, and they never will, and it's not especially relevant either. Fast forward, Egypt runs Gaza until 1967. Then the Israelis beat Egypt like a drum.
Correct. It's like actually putting it mildly.
Yeah, they just trash them.
Yeah, yes, it takes, I think, 4 days for them to get to the Suez Canal, but the war is really over in 45 minutes. They catch the Egyptian Air Force on the ground and it's over.
That's it. That's ball game. And so now Israel controls the entire Sinai, if I'm remembering correctly, in addition to Gaza. So that's quite a bit of territory. I don't know what they do with Gaza. I think they start settling Jews in there. There's actually Jewish settlements inside Gaza because those settlements need to get removed when Sharon comes along 40 years later, right?
But I don't know if those settlements, I don't think, predate 1967.
Suffice it to say that Gaza has a very complicated history, and it seems like that history is about to get even more complicated. Although, to be clear, nothing has happened yet. And some have suggested that Trump is staking out an extreme bargaining position, which he likes to do. He likes to say absolutely absurd, ridiculous nonsense. And this isn't nonsense. Like, this is pretty dangerous shit. But it's just so far outside of the Overton window, or what used to be the Overton window, that it's like people were very surprised. It's preposterous. Doesn't mean it can't happen. However, Egyptian president and military dictator al-Sisi responded
Trump's
to this.
favorite dictator.
Yes, yeah. Was like prior to this, he was like, we're not taking any refugees. We're not helping you. We're not doing anything. Rebuild this. Fuck you. This is your doing. So you fix it. After hearing this on a phone call with French President Emmanuel Macron, he said, actually, we have a plan to rebuild the Gaza Strip. This was on Wednesday. This was 2 days ago, right? And he was not saying that prior to Trump spouting off, which I think is interesting and suggestive, right? The Arabs really don't want this to happen, obviously. They don't want to accept the Palestinians. They certainly don't want that. And we've talked about that in the past. So there's some degree of hypocrisy here. I would say a large degree.
I don't know what he's supposed to do. So this would put him in such a tough spot because the reaction from ordinary Egyptians will be not good.
Yeah, to say the least. It's damned if you do, damned if you don't, right?
Yeah, and like, this is not a new concern for the authorities in Cairo, but they are constantly worried about conservative and particularly Islamist groups challenging their authority, and that goes back decades. That goes back to when
right.
Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was Egypt's president, first president after independence, really important guy, the Muslim Brotherhood tried to kill him.
Yeah, so I think he executed Qutb.
He did execute Said Qutb. He executed a bunch of other members of the organization. And there was a time thereafter when the Egyptians took more of a lighter touch. But since the 90s, and especially since the Arab Spring, when the Muslim Brotherhood showed it was perfectly capable of winning elections if they were free and fair. And by the way, this is the same for the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Jordanians. They all are worried about this.
Not democracies.
From his perspective, like, this becoming a major issue is a big problem politically. My question is, where is he going to get the money for this?
I don't know. If I had to guess, I would say Europe.
Or the Emirates and the Saudis.
Maybe.
Like the Qataris. They've done it in the past. They've helped rebuild Gaza.
He'd better figure it out quick. And maybe that is enough to stop this from happening. Although one gets the sense that if Israel wants it to happen, it's now going to happen.
Yeah, so let me ask you, is that what this is about? Because this very much aligns with what the Israeli public and the Israeli leadership, at least in the current government, seemingly prefers. So
yeah,
is that
they're ready for a one-state solution, is what all the public opinion data is telling us. They've been heading this direction for a while. Obviously, October 7th decisively tipped the scales over towards that state of affairs. And it's not hard to understand why. Again, the biggest attack on Jews since the Holocaust. And yeah, it was intended to provoke a reaction, and it did. And one could even call it, what, a fifth or a sixth Arab-Israeli war, which Israel has won. And we talked about that, I think, 2 shows ago. They've beaten Hezbollah, not Arabs mostly, but whatever. They've beaten the Iranians. They've beaten Hamas, obviously. Hamas has recruited new people, but like their capability is nowhere near what it used to be. Who else have they beaten? Like all comers, right?
The Houthis are standing down for the moment. And
yeah, they hit the Houthis.
I wasn't too worried about them anyway. Assad is gone, so that's a big blow to the Iranians.
They blew up all of the new guy's military in Syria. I forget his name.
Ahmed al-Shara.
Al-Jilani.
That's his. And then the other thing is, like, people are like, oh, this is going to torpedo their normalization with the Saudis. I've never been so sure how much that matters. Yes, if it jeopardizes the ability to maintain this anti-Iran counterbalancing coalition that's coming into existence in the last decade, that would be a big deal. But it's not clear to me that the Israelis lose much from the cooperation with Riyadh being covert. Yeah, it would be nice to have a big celebration ceremony, But I think we know what MBS and the rest of the Saudi leadership wants when it comes to choosing between the Israelis and the Iranians. Yeah, they're hedging their bets with the Iranians, but I think they're just going to wait this out.
The Iranians are retrograde. They can't help the Saudis as much as the Israelis can. And everything we know about MBS suggests that he wants to create a Silicon Valley type situation and in Saudi Arabia, which could not be any further. We now have like Saudi venture capitalists and stuff. Okay, great. But they need Israeli know-how. They need Israeli technology. Israel famously is Silicon Valley in the desert, basically. Startup nation. Yeah, they have more startups per capita than anywhere on earth. And a lot of them are very successful. And I think Israeli GDP per capita is now on a par with like, maybe not Switzerland, but certainly the richer European countries.
Check it out.
Yeah, check it out. Follow that up.
It's like $52,000.
Yeah, that beats Canada, I think.
Yeah,
or close to it.
So then, given all that, I guess the question I have is: have a debate about how much this matters, about how much a two-state solution matters strategically for the United States. I co-authored a piece right after October 7th arguing that it does, even though I have thought that solution is dead for a long time. But I think the U.S. has a strategic interest in taking a more balanced approach to this conflict. It's not going to.
Not under Trump's leadership.
No, it wasn't. I would argue it hasn't been in maybe since Eisenhower.
A big argument about Trump is that his policies, they're very different. But the main thing that is different about him is he says the quiet part out loud.
Yeah. But then this is my question is like, what is the U.S. interest in taking over Gaza? Isn't that the worst possible outcome for you want to be more deeply involved in the Middle East? In the part of the Middle East that's like the most sensitive? What possible rationale is there for the United States wanting to control the Gaza Strip?
None whatsoever. And also the idea of like mass expulsions of Palestinians, like where does that leave the Israeli Arabs? This opens the door to a lot of extremely dangerous possibilities. I don't know.
I'm even just leaving aside the morality. I think we agree on that. I'm just like, what if you're okay with, if we're calling it ethnic cleansing, and if it's forced displacements of large numbers of people from the same ethnicity, like
what the fuck else do you call it?
I don't really see so if you're okay with that, like what then is the argument for the United States administering this area rather than the Israelis?
I don't think it would happen. Maybe he just likes to build fancy buildings with his name on them and gold-plated toilets.
So that was my other answer is like, maybe it's like a personal.
It's a personal interest of his. Yeah. And we know that Trump, shall we say, has not made huge efforts to disentangle his personal interests from the interests of the United States.
That's correct.
To put it mildly. It's probably
to your earlier point. What's Trump's foreign policy? Let's stop getting involved in these nation building exercises. Let's not be so overextended. Let's focus on the real threats in the Asia Pacific.
Yeah. A lot of the people around him feel that way, and he doesn't like China or the Chinese. We know that. But Trump's foreign policy is idiosyncratic. There's no unifying principle behind it. It's somewhat isolationist, but shit like this, you're just like, it's whatever this fucking guy wants to do at the time. There's no unifying principle other than however he woke up on any given day. And now he has control of the government and the military and U.S. aid, although that's been dissolved, diplomatic apparatus, everything. And
more or less, yeah.
Yeah, they're all run by cronies and loyalists of, shall we say, varying levels of competence, and they're going to do it.
So if I were to ask you, you're putting money on this.
Yeah.
Leaving aside the whole, I don't see a world where the United States is in charge of Gaza. I just think that would be very unpopular. But
I don't think, his base doesn't want him to do that. A lot of his base are anti-Semitic.
So but in terms of greenlighting the displacement of Gazans and Israel's annexation of the West Bank, would you view those as likely scenarios? because I would not be surprised if that's where the policy heads.
Yeah, neither would I, unfortunately. And we're seeing enough smoke now that there's fire here. And like we started to see the smoke last week, and the smoke is now a lot heavier. And I think it is the case with Trump voters that he's like Steve Jobs to them. Steve Jobs famously remarked, I tell people what they want because people don't know what they want. It's like I could do focus groups all day and end up with a shitty product that makes no sense. And that's what most tech people end up doing instead of actually creating something and giving to them sort of fully formed and being like, this is what you want. He's in a position, he's demonstrated it repeatedly, to basically tell them what they want. And then they go along with it. So it's not so much the voters responding to his performance, it's him telling them what his performance is. And that's how demagoguery works. And that's why the United States is where it is at the moment.
Okay. This is what he said when asked about U.S. policy on Israel annexing the West Bank. He said, quote, we're discussing that with many of your representatives. You're represented very well. When asked whether he supported Israeli sovereignty in Judea and Samaria.
This is the West Bank, by the way.
Correct. He said, people do like the idea, but we haven't taken a position on it yet. We'll be making an announcement probably on that very specific topic over the next 4 weeks. So in addition to that, which I would not say if you're a Palestinian is a reassuring message, he's appointed Mike Huckabee to be the U.S. ambassador in Israel. Huckabee is very much in favor of Israel annexing the West Bank.
Greater Israel. Yeah, he's a Christian conservative, charismatic, right?
Christian Zionist, very much so. Much of Trump's base is Christian Zionist.
And just to explain what this is, these are Christian fundamentalists, effectively, who want to kick off the rapture by ensuring that the Jews control the entirety of the Holy Land, right? Including Judea and Samaria.
Judea and Samaria, the biblical names for what is the West Bank. And they, like Israeli prime ministers in the past, refer to the West Bank as Judea and Samaria. I also just always like making the point, essentially the theology here, according to people that believe this stuff, it comes from something called Christian millennial dispensationalism, which basically is a interpretation of the Bible that the Jews need to recontrol the Holy Land, rebuild the third temple in Jerusalem.
Yep.
This will bring about the rapture and judgment day. And I always just like making the point that as supportive of these people are to Israel, in their prophecy, things do not work out well for the Jews.
Correct. That's the best part of this. Oh yeah, no, we need you guys to light the fuse so that Jesus Christ comes back to earth, and then you are all damned to hell. If I'm remembering correctly.
And I can't remember who said it, but there's some famous quote. God, I can't remember. But basically it was like, if they support us now, we'll worry about the afterlife later, something to that effect.
Sure.
He's the U.S. ambassador to Israel. Elise Stefanik, she who made a name for herself grilling the former Harvard president over anti-Semitism.
And at one point, an anti-Trumper, I think. That has
there's too many of people who've made that shift for me to remember, man.
Pretty much all of them. Yeah.
Anyway, she's the UN ambassador now. She's very much a supporter of annexation. Given all that and the record from his first term, like, I don't find this surprising at all. It's one of those things that the real world implications are so
staggering,
terrible for real world people that it's hard for me to wrap my head around it. But as an analyst where I'm sitting, that does strike me as likely policy that the administration is going to support.
So let's think about the unthinkable, because we have to do that now. And we have to do that in a lot of different areas, not just the Middle East. But let's start there. What does this look like? We know that the Israeli military is preparing an airport and a seaport for departures. I have read that they're like either the US or the Israelis or both administrations are looking around for places to resettle Palestinians. And one of those places is Puntland
Yeah,
in Somalia.
you sent me this. You need to tell me more about this.
Yeah. Okay. So Somalia is a war-torn country in the Horn of Africa. If you've ever seen Black Hawk Down, great movie, bad situation. That's Somalia. Somalia is really not in any better shape than it was in the 90s. It's controlled by warlords. Puntland is a semi-autonomous, nominally independent part of Somalia. So it's, I don't know, it's a no man's land, effectively.
Wikipedia refers to it as a de facto state.
A de facto state, yeah. And so that's like kind of an ungoverned space. You look at pictures of this place, not super appealing. And whoever, I'm not exactly sure who the president of Puntland did or the local potentate, but he was like, oh yeah, no, we'll totally take fellow Muslims just as long as it's voluntary. And I was reading this article and thinking, and the check's clear. So this is one spot. They're looking around to North Africa. I don't know where else.
But I guess what look, that's wild. I don't have much to add.
We're talking about millions of people here.
But so
millions of people.
That was, according to what you sent me, like that was voluntary people emigrating from Gaza.
Yes, to whatever extent it is voluntary.
So right? This is I firmly believe the vast majority of Palestinians in both Gaza and the West Bank are not going to leave voluntarily.
I think you're probably right about that. I don't know what inducements you could offer them. I guess last time we did a little thought experiment where I asked, what's the absolute best way to do a one-state solution? And we talked about that a little bit and we concluded, this isn't going to happen. And there's two ways to look at that. One is it's simply not going to happen. There's not going to be any kind of expulsion, voluntary or otherwise. Two is it is going to happen, but not that way. It's not going to happen in a kind, gentle way. And there's not going to be anything good waiting on the other side. There won't be any inducements, right? I don't know.
I was asked about this, I think back in the fall, someone was writing, a journalist was writing a piece. And like my take, which it's just like, if we are talking about severe levels of violence, like killing mass numbers of people, I just don't know if that's how this goes. I
sure hope not. But it's like, how do you forcibly relocate millions of people who don't want to be relocated in such a way that nobody gets hurt?
And I don't think there's an answer to that. Right.
It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen.
So then the other check, right, that we talked about last time, that the check on this, maybe not on this specifically, although there have been voices within Israel going back decades, it's just become much more widespread in recent years, but has been the United States. And we were saying that if Trump is reconsidering U.S. policy, then that check is out. The one thing I have questions about is, imagine this for a second in the rest of, not just the rest of the world, but specifically in the Middle East, right? The absolute uproar that is going to ensue if there are forced displacements and large numbers of killings of Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank. I don't think that is something that Arab leaders in the region can just ignore.
And I don't think that they're capable of controlling it. And I don't think that they're capable of stopping the Israelis and the Americans from doing this.
But that might jeopardize their ability to maintain an aligned position with the United States on things like Iran. Which we know Trump,
another wave of revolutions, right, in the Middle
East.
But
we know Trump cares about Iran. We know Iran has been U.S. strategic interest in the region number one. That might actually be a check that Trump cannot afford to just. And unlike some of these other things where he was like, "We're going to take it over," on the West Bank, he was like, "I need 4 weeks to think about it."
I need to read 25 books. Except I'll have Kushner do it. I don't read. Again, I was elected to lead, not to read.
He went to Jared. He went to Jared.
He went to Jared. Just go to Jared.
God damn it, dude.
I don't know what Jared's up to. Jared's got that Saudi money now.
The number of times that and I'm doing it in class now. I'm having these conversations. I either just say, it's now the millennial creed, right? It is what it is.
Yeah.
Or what a time to be alive.
It's what a time to be alive. Yeah, I think the United States becomes a huge target in this eventuality.
That's the other thing, right?
And
Sorry, go
by
ahead.
the way, Trump is disassembling the domestic security apparatus and is going to replace everybody with flunkies and cronies who probably aren't as good at their jobs. So keep that in mind as this
Well,
progresses.
this is a little far afield too, but I was embarrassed to say I wasn't fully aware of the extent of this. But there's also apparently quite a serious recruiting crisis for the U.S. military right now.
Yeah, I can't
Um,
imagine why that would be the case.
I think it's not new, but the military is like having to think about adjusting its standards and
Mhm.
having trouble maintaining ships in the Navy and maintaining a fighting force given the array of global commitments the United States has. But I guess to bring it back to that to me is the question. I don't think for a second that Trump or any other of the higher ups in the administration care about the moral implications of any of this. I don't believe
I don't
that.
know.
I don't think anyone in the Israeli government, and I think the Israeli public, and if you were American after 9/11, you can relate to the shock of something as awful as 10/7. I don't
Yeah,
think
10/7
there's
proportionally was worse than September 11th
correct.
for the
Like,
Israelis.
and for most Israelis, although I think this is a horribly distorted version of history, the death of the peace process came in 2000, 2001 anyway.
Hmm.
So I don't think moral considerations are what's holding this back. But if it turns out that like you start seeing steps in this direction, in the unthinkable, as you put it, I think the regional just absolute
Shit show.
yeah shit show that will ensue and the potential that implications that has for real important US strategic interests in the region, particularly vis-a-vis Iran, might lead the administration to think twice. But I'm like not at all confident about that.
Yeah, I'm not confident about that because what we know about Trump is, yeah, he wants to lean on the Iranians and needs help to do it. On the other hand, he seems to think that the United States can go it alone in many circumstances without consulting any allies. Obviously, he went off the cuff down this particular road without consulting any Arab allies at all. Everybody was surprised, very unpleasantly surprised.
I think Netanyahu was a little surprised, and just judging
Everybody,
from
it's
the facial expressions. Yeah, what the
yeah.
fuck just happened?
Yeah, now I have to come up with something to say. It's insane. Yeah. So it's like, why would he take their feelings into consideration? Like, even in the service of his own strategic aims.
But you don't think, look, there's a segment of the US electorate that I think you could interpret what he said literally, and it would be, what did he say? Like, I could shoot someone in broad daylight on Fifth Avenue and they wouldn't abandon me. I think that's true, actually.
That was 9 years ago. He said that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think there's whatever it is, 30 to 35% of the US electorate that's there.
Yeah.
You don't think that like some of his appeal stems from like these fucking elites that got us into the Iraq war and we were in Afghanistan for 20 years and all these sorts of foreign commitments, so on and so forth? If he screws up the Middle East even worse than the United States has already done so, and it requires like a serious allocation of resources to the region or puts a giant target on the back of the United States, like those are real things that
It's a
I
real
think he
problem.
has. Yeah.
It's a real problem, but like, those are future problems. And this is happening now. And I don't think he thinks too hard about future problems. And he relies on his ability to tell his supporters what they should want. And I understand that's actually been pretty reliable, right? So this is the best thing for us to do. Don't you agree? And they're like, yeah, no, we totally agree. Like, you're doing a great job. Keep doing what you're doing, Donnie.
I also
Um,
think a lot of his core supporter, and especially like on this particular issue, want nothing more than for Israel to annex these territories. And so
yeah,
there's
and
gonna
there's a tension there because the Trump coalition is very diverse, in the sense that you have these like Christian fundamentalists, but you also have these white nationalists, right? And I'm like, that's really complicated. And then you have actually a lot of minorities now too, right? A lot of people who
yeah,
aren't focused on
it's
foreign affairs at all. They don't care at
it's
all.
the Democratic Party is like, I have this line that I use in class, like one of the great achievements of Iranian foreign policy over the last 40 years or so is to be so disliked universally that it has pushed the Arabs and Israelis together. It's like
Yeah.
the
Quite an
Democratic
achievement.
Party, yeah, the Democratic Party has been so ineffective politically that it's just hemorrhaging its core constituencies to the
Yeah.
Republicans. Like,
Yeah. The only people that are left have graduate degrees, right, Galen? And me, I'm so disgusted. I'm like, why would I give you guys more money? You're just gonna fuck it up.
yeah, man,
Yeah,
it's
but
we should probably do an episode on that level of incompetence, by the
we
way.
we we totally should. Yeah, I don't know what's going to happen. Trump's put us on the clock 4 weeks for more details about the West Bank. Nobody was fucking talking about the West Bank. We were talking about Gaza, and this thing just keeps expanding.
We talked a little bit about the West Bank, I guess,
We
last,
did.
but hey, maybe this is our cue to say we are not talking about this for another 4 weeks.
Yeah, we're going to take a break. Next week, we hope to be talking a little bit about Ukraine. We're going to turn our attention to Ukraine because apparently Trump's peace plan for Ukraine might come out next week. So we'll have some details there.
Yeah.
And that would be a nice break from Gaza because this fucking sucks. It's a huge bummer.
Yeah. And I think, as you put it, this is really dangerous stuff.
Extremely dangerous and massive implications. But again, another indication that Global Tantrum might be the right name for this show, right?
We haven't come up with anything better. I also,
No.
This is the last thing I want to say, by the way, as particularly his part about the US taking over Gaza. Like, this is as bad as an idea as I've seen. I don't want for a second for anyone listening to this to think that this started with Trump. The United States has time and again screwed this up going back decades, and Israelis and Palestinians have time and again screwed this up. So this is not a good idea that he's floating out, in my opinion, but we are not in this situation because of, mainly at least, for anything he did. He certainly did some things during his first term that I would argue were not particularly helpful to resolving the situation, but I would argue by that point things were already in a pretty impossible state. So
you're right.
You could argue this is the culmination of decades and decades of US incompetence, and it's now getting what it deserves.
Of a historical process, but it's also the transition into a new paradigm where thinking about what is right or what is good or what is legal is no longer relevant to these people. They don't care. Like, these are words on paper, and that's a big change, right? At least in the past, we had lip service to that stuff and honest efforts even further in the past, right? You'd argue that U.S. policy towards Israeli-Palestine issue has been hollow for decades now. And I don't necessarily disagree, but like, we were still operating within the United Nations preferred two.
Yeah, look, we would have to spend way more time on this, which neither of us has nor
We're
wants
not going
to
to do it.
But like, you use the word lip service, and at least I would argue since like at the latest 2010.
Sure.
That's largely what we've been talking about.
Yeah, we've been talking about can kicking, and this is the wages of can kicking to a certain extent.
And I could make a strong case that it goes back before that.
Yeah, I believe it.
And if I had to come up with anything positive to say about this, is that I don't like lip service. And at least Trump isn't spouting bullshit that I know isn't true. He's just saying stuff that's
awful.
Yeah, worse.
Yeah. Do we prefer the pretty lies or the horrendous truth?
Like, no. I'll just quickly tell this story. The document, the famous or infamous, depending on where you stand, document that has governed Arab-Israeli negotiations going back to the 1967 war is United Nations Security Council Resolution 242, which, like, notoriously is deliberately worded incredibly ambiguously such that everyone can claim that it means what they think it means, which in effect means we have zero consensus on what to do. It's hard. It's a land for peace document, right? Israel will give back land. The Arabs will give peace in exchange. The question that is not clarified is how much land for how much peace. I guess when I say like this goes back decades and there's lip service, like if you look at the history of even the administration at the time, the Johnson administration that helped negotiate that, like, I would argue in bad faith made promises about what it meant. And certainly the UN ambassador at the time, a guy named Arthur Goldberg, who was the guy that was the US representative that negotiated it, after he left office, disseminated a view that the US had not made these promises, which it absolutely had if you look at the documentation. And so it's not surprising to me that this is where we are.
It was basically, it's the fruit of a rotten process. It's what you're getting at. It's like from the very beginning, it was a bad faith process. It's basically what you're saying. I don't know enough about it, but that would make sense to me. I believe that people have operated in good faith over time within that framework.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And there work though.
There are people who like Jimmy Carter, I think very much genuinely wanted this. I just think he was really bad at his job.
Yes. Yeah. He was a much better humanitarian after he left office.
RIP, but Clinton, I don't want to talk about.
Okay. All right. Let's leave it there.
Okay.
This is insane. We're not going to talk about it next week.
We're doing Ukraine next week.
Yeah. Next week, Ukraine, unless some other crazy shit kicks off. But we're taking a break from Gaza. Thanks for watching or listening. This has been Global Tantrum. Till next time.
See you, Steve.
Yeah, likewise. Bye, Galen.
Bye, guys.